Hey, what's up everybody? 8-Bit Flashback here. Today I'll be unboxing and reviewing the new Sega Genesis Mini. Plus I'll be talking about some custom 3D printed cartridges you can make for the Genesis Mini. And also joining me today is my very rude and annoying co-host, Mex Headroom.
You still alive out there? Good.
So I pre-ordered my Sega Genesis Mini from Walmart on the first day that the pre-orders went live, and it showed up at my door on the release date of September 19th, 2019. The Sega Genesis Mini is kind of a big deal, especially to Sega fans like myself. This is an official Sega product made by Sega. This isn't just another Sega Genesis clone with a bunch of crappy shovelware games built in. This is the real deal. Sega's last real gaming console was the Dreamcast, and that was released 20 years ago. So it's great to see Sega back in action again with their new mini console. So let's see what we got inside the box. Here is the power adapter. This is a 1 amp power supply, and it uses a micro USB cable to plug into the Sega Genesis. And here's a look at one of the controllers. And I'm really impressed with the way these controllers look. I know a lot of people out there are bummed that this is not the 6-button controller, but I'm a big fan of the original 3-button controller. As far as the quality goes, everything feels nice, the D-pad feels good, the buttons all feel nice and clicky, but we'll have to play some games to find out how well it actually works. And let's go ahead and dig some more stuff out of the box. Here is the second controller, and it does have a 6-foot cable. And at the end of this cable where it plugs into the Genesis, it does have the word Sega imprinted on it, so it's got some extra detail on there, and I think all this little extra detail looks great. Here's the Sega Genesis manual. There's not a lot to this, it's pretty easy to set this thing up. Here's the micro USB cable that plugs into the AC adapter and your HDMI cable. And it looks like we got one more thing left in the box, and that would be the mini console itself. And this thing is bringing back some crazy memories. This looks just like the original Sega Genesis console, only mini.
Oh, the childhood memories. I remember them so distinctly.
The first time I played the original Sega Genesis was way back in 1989, and that was at my friend's house. He just got one for his birthday, and we were both playing the game Altered Beast. And I remember being blown away by the arcade-style graphics, having never seen graphics like that before, at least never on a home console. And now, 30 years later, I can relive that experience in 720p HD resolution. A lot of extra details went into this mini console, such as the cartridge slot that does open, but there's nothing inside there, it just goes to a blank space. On the back of the console is where you're going to find your HDMI output along with your USB power port. Then on the bottom we have great detail as well. They even took the time to make the expansion port lid open, just like the original Sega Genesis. That way you can open this up and lose the lid, just like everybody else did back in the day with their original Genesis. After opening the lid, you're going to find out that there's no real connector inside there. This is just all for looks. But they do sell an optional mini Sega Tower of Power that includes the Sega CD and the 32X add-ons. But these are non-functional accessories, they're just for looks. But they do look really cool, and they give it a nice retro look. And I do plan on getting these accessories if they make a US version. Right now the only version they have for sale is the Mega Drive version, and I'm looking to get the actual Sega Genesis version. So when that releases, I'll be getting one of those. And here's a comparison next to the original Sega Genesis Model 1, and all the detail looks very, very close. The only thing that looked just a little bit different to me was this red color on my Genesis Model 1. It looks to be more of a solid red color, but on my Genesis Mini, it kind of has a pinkish reddish color to it. But after digging out another Sega Genesis that I own, I found out that the color on this one seems to be very, very similar. So it looks like that red color just varies with the Model 1s.
Well, I can't remember the last time I was this entertained.
Alright, I get it. The color doesn't matter. For those of you out there that are not fans of the original 3-button controller for the Genesis Mini, you do have the option to use Retrobit's officially licensed Sega controllers. And these do work great. I personally have used these to play multiple different games, and I've had no issues. And I didn't have to do anything special to make this controller work. All I did is plugged it in, and it worked. Here's a side-by-side comparison with the Genesis Mini in Retroflag's MegaPie case. They do look pretty similar, but as you can see, it's a little bit smaller and a little bit fatter in height. And here is a Sega Genesis USB Hub, and this is a little bit smaller and slimmer. And a lot of people use these to put Raspberry Pi 3s inside of. And here it is again next to the Genesis Model 1. And as you can see, they did a very good job with detail. We got the volume slider here, although it's not functional. There is a reset button, and it is functional, but it doesn't quite work the same way. It also has a functional on and off switch, along with a red LED light. And here's a look at some custom mini cartridges I made for my Sega Genesis Mini. And these are 3D printed, and I do plan on releasing some plans on how to make these yourself here soon, but I gotta work out a few more details first. And if I'm making mini cartridges, why not make a mini Game Genie? Now these are not functional, these are just for looks and entertainment purposes, and I'm definitely entertained. And who out there remembers playing the Sega Channel?
Me neither.
Well, I do, and I have a lot of awesome memories that revolve around the Sega Channel. Now all these little mini cartridges I've made are just fresh off the 3D printer, and I didn't do any finish work on these, so some of these look a little rough, but these are just prototypes to give you an example of what you can make for your Sega Genesis Mini. And if I wanted to, I could even make a mini Sega CD add-on, like I did with this Megatron Transformer a while back. But making one now really doesn't make sense, especially when they've already released the official Mega CD accessory with that Mega Tower kit in Japan. And here's a comparison of the new Sega Genesis Mini controller next to the original 3-button controller. Now at first I thought the D-pad was a little loose on the new controller, but after going back and testing out the D-pad on the original controller, it feels pretty much the same. But we still have to test out the new controller while playing a game to know for sure how well it works. So we have 42 built-in games, and we can view those games in a couple different modes. If you push the B button on the remote, that'll put it in bookshelf mode. And if you push it again, that'll switch it right back. As far as the gaming lineup goes, I think it's really good. There's a lot of great titles mixed in here that I'm definitely going to be playing. There is a few titles here and there that I probably won't play very much, such as Tetris, but for the most part, I like most of these games. And for the menu layout, it's nice and simplistic, it's easy to figure out how to navigate through everything, and it's got a great retro feel to it, along with some really catchy menu music tunes. Here is Megaman Wily Wars, and this is a game that was never released in the US. So if we push the reset button on the console, that'll take us to a menu where we can save the game, reset the game, or we can exit the game. And there is 4 save game slots available, so I'm going to go ahead and save it to slot 1, and go ahead and resume the game. And we can also access this menu with the controller. If we just hold the start button for a few seconds, I think it's maybe about 3 seconds, then that'll bring up this menu again, where you can do the same thing. We can save the game, exit the game, resume the game, whatever. And this time, I'm going to go ahead and exit the game. As far as the emulation went for Megaman Wily Wars, it was playing just like it should. I didn't notice any issues with lag or sound. It seems to be playing great. Now let's go ahead and find another game to play. Let's try out Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And this is a game I test out on a lot of different platforms and emulators, so I can usually spot if there's something wrong right away. And while playing this game, I didn't notice any issues. The sound seems great, the controls seem to be working good, and I'm not noticing any lag. And as far as I can tell, the game is playing at full speed most of the time. Now I did have issues with some slowdown when playing in 2-player mode, but I believe that's an issue on the original Sega Genesis Model 1 as well. Now I have read interviews with the developers of the Sega Genesis Mini console, and they did state that they try to keep all the bugs and glitches the same with the games, but for some of the games they did raise the clock speed to adjust for processing power, so some games that had slowdown, they supposedly raised the clock speed for those games. But with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in 2-player mode, there is definitely some slowdown noticeable. Inside the settings, there's a couple different things you can play with, such as wallpaper. You can change the background from a couple different things. You can also play with the screen aspect ratio. You can change that from full screen to standard 4:3 ratio. And we can also change the language. And when we do this, it also changes the menu. So we're going to start off by picking German. And now we're going to go ahead and go back. And now we're going to be presented with the Mega Drive menu. So this is what the Mega Drive menu looks like over in Europe. Now we're going to go back and change the language again to Japanese. And you want to be careful when you switch that language because you might have a hard time navigating back to the original English language. Just remember that the language is the second choice in the options, and then once you're inside the language menu, English will also be the second choice. So that's kind of cool. Just by changing the language, we can change it from a Sega Genesis to a Mega Drive. And as far as the cosmetics go for this mini console, I really only have one complaint. I wish it had some rubber feet, and I can add these easily, but I think it should have came with it because this thing slides around like crazy. But to be fair, the original Sega Genesis Model 1 did not seem to have rubber feet either. But it did way enough to where it didn't slide around like the Genesis Mini does. When trying out the game Toe Jam and Earl, I noticed something that seemed really cool to me. The menu music is some of the same music they used for the Sega Channel menu, and even some of the graphics seem very similar to how the Sega Channel menu looked.
Anyone else out there getting tired?
Okay, I get it. That might be boring to some people, but I thought it was interesting. And here is one of my favorite games for the Sega Genesis, Vectorman. This game's got great music, I think it's got great graphics, and it seems to be one of those games that people either love or hate, and obviously I love this game. And same thing with this game, everything seems to be playing just like it should, just like I remember. Now let's go ahead and play the game here for just a few seconds. Now I have heard of reports of audio lag on the Sega Genesis Mini with certain games like Columns and a few other games. But for myself, while playing Columns, it wasn't really an issue for me. I didn't really notice it. It might be present, but it wasn't bothering me and it didn't seem noticeable to me. But with other games like Tetris, I did notice some audio lag. In fact, that's the only game I could really notice it. And to be honest, in my opinion, I just don't think this is that great a game anyway, so I don't think you're missing out on that much. But I did notice when I was putting the blocks down, the sound it makes when it's smashing down to the ground sometimes seemed like it was delayed. But I would say this is a minor issue and it's barely noticeable, so I'd say this is not a big deal. And if you do like this game, I think you can still have fun playing this. So here's my overall thoughts on the Sega Genesis Mini. I think the developers at M2 did a great job with the emulation on the Genesis Mini. It's the same emulator that they use on the Wii U Virtual Console, called M2 Engage. I find the emulation for all the games to be very acceptable. There is a few small audio issues that can be found in games like Tetris or Columns, but for the most part, I would say the emulation is very solid. When comparing the Sega Genesis Mini to other mini retro consoles, such as the NES Classic Edition or Super Nintendo Classic Edition, I would say the Sega Genesis Mini is definitely on the same level. The hardware specs are pretty much identical when compared to the Super Nintendo and NES Classic Editions. As far as the looks go, I would probably give a slight edge to the Sega Genesis Mini because of its amazing detail. Having a functional cartridge slot and optional accessories you can add, such as the Sega CD N32X along with the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge, make this thing even more special. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of people are disappointed about that 3-button controller instead of the 6-button controller. For me, it's not such a big deal because I do have the extra controller from Retrobit, and I don't mind the 3-button controller at all. It seems to work great, and it has not given me any issues yet. Is the Sega Genesis Mini perfect? No, it does have some small issues. But, in my opinion, I think this is the best mini retro console so far. Sega has done a great job in really capturing the spirit of the original Sega Genesis Model 1. The Sega Genesis ruled the early 90s with awesome games and attitude unlike any other company at the time. And now you can relive that experience with the Sega Genesis Mini. Okay, it's time for me to go. If you like this video, if you could hit that like button, and I'm going to leave you with some gameplay footage from a handful of different games on the Sega Genesis Mini.
Power up. Power up.
You've got a secret bonus point.
And I'd like to give a big shout out to a very special person that's breathtaking, inspiring, stunning, imposing, stirring, impressive, affordable, fearsome, dreaded, and mind-boggling, not to mention mind-blowing. Yours truly, next Headroom. What I want to know is why are the only funny lines on this show the ones behind me?